Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Faith Talk, our podcast where we talk all things theology, religion, and life's tough questions. I'm Oliver Robles, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Payton Arnett.
Welcome, welcome. This is a different setup. We're not,
Yeah.
usually not here. We're
I
usually
know.
somewhere else.
This is a brand new. This is our office, actually, a brand new office. We just moved here.
Yeah, this is our office. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, and today we are joined by Dr. Stephen C Meyer. And sometimes I try to introduce people and go through the rap sheet, but I'm just going to let you do that instead. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us some background.
I am a philosopher of science, and I have been a proponent of the theory of intelligent design. I am a proponent of the theory of intelligent design, and I initially started out in physics and geology, and have been long interested in questions at the intersection between science and faith, and ended up pursuing, as a result of that, a doctorate in the philosophy of science at Cambridge University with a specific focus on a scientific question, which is the origin of life. So I did a PhD on origin of life biology within a program in the history and philosophy of science. So I'm kind of a mongrel, but very interested in those really important worldview questions that lie at the boundaries between science and philosophy. I've written 3 big books about that. One, Signature in the Cell, about the origin of the first life. Second is Darwin's Doubt, which is about the origin of animal life, and an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion. And then my most recent book is called The Return to the God Hypothesis, where I'm addressing the question, well, if there is evidence of intelligent design in the living world, who is the best candidate for having been the designing intelligence? Is it a space alien, an immanent intelligence within the cosmos, as some scientists have proposed? Or is it a transcendent intelligence, a designing intelligence who is separate from the cosmos, often also known as God? So I develop a more extensive argument for God as the designer by bringing in evidence from cosmology and physics, as well as the biological evidence that I looked at in the first 2 books.
Do you have any books in the work right now that you can tell us about?
I'm not working on books as much as dissemination of key ideas. Working on a scientific paper that's designed specifically for, with some of our other colleagues, that is explicating how scientists can take the concept of intelligent design, work with it in the laboratory to generate testable predictions. So, in other words, to show what's called the heuristic value of intelligent design as a guide to discovery. And many of our early works on intelligent design were showing the explanatory power of intelligent design, looking at features of cells or features of the fossil record or features of the universe that are best explained by positing the activity of a designing mind or intelligence or conscious agent, as opposed to an undirected material process. But good scientific theories are sometimes only provide better explanatory power. Sometimes good scientific theories have predictive success, but really good scientific theories often provide both explanatory power and predictive success. And there are a lot of things that flow out of the concept of the concept of intelligent design that suggest empirical consequences, things that we ought to find or would be more likely to find if a designing agent played a role in the history of life rather than purely undirected material processes. We know a lot about what designing agents do. And we know that there are some things that designing agents' minds can do that brute matter cannot do, or that material processes cannot do. So when and if we find things in living systems, for example, that are the sorts of things that we would expect a designing agent to do, but not the sort of things we would expect brute matter or undirected material processes to do, then we have additional confirmation of the theory. And there are a number of things that we can go out and look for that would be confirmatory in that way. So one of the first examples of this was that our our colleagues in the ID movement, our research community, predicted that the so-called junk DNA would turn out not to be junk at all, that it would have important functions. We accept that that mutations are real processes, that natural selection and random mutation affect organisms. They produce, we think, small-scale variation within certain limits, but we also think there's evidence of the activity of a designing agent at discrete points in the history of life. And so our view of the so-called junk DNA was, well, we would expect to see some evidence of that random mutation trial and error process, and that would cause some accumulation of mutational error, sections of the genome that wouldn't code for proteins or do anything else. But we wouldn't expect that the signal would be dwarfed by the noise, that would be so much mutation such that the claim was that 97% of the genome, because it's non-coding for proteins, is non-functional altogether. So you have, in that case, more noise than signal. That if life were the product of a designing intelligence, I don't think we'd see so much wasted text, okay, in the genetic text. And so beginning in the 90s and right up through the early 2000s, there were a number of key ID proponents and ID sympathizing scientists who were suggesting maybe that those non-coding regions should be, would reveal important functions, maybe not coding for proteins, but maybe other functions. And that's exactly what's been discovered. So that was a prediction of the theory of intelligent design that's been borne out. It's been documented by something called the ENCODE project, which was published in 2011. And some of the key people who made this prediction were Richard Sternberg, William Dembski, Dean Kenyon, Forrest Mims, all either proponents of intelligent design or, in the case of Sternberg, a quiet sympathizer when he began to say, hey, there's probably more going on here than these non-coding regions just being non-functional. So anyway, an example of an ID prediction, and I'm working on a paper right now to explicate the logic of, to show laboratory scientists and others how you can test intelligent design in addition to the modes of testing I've already explicated, describing how you can test a historical scientific theory by evaluating its comparative explanatory power. If it explains facts we already have better than competing hypotheses, that's a good way of testing a theory, an historical theory, and it's also, it provides support for the theory. But it may be that there's additional support, or it may be that intelligent design as a concept is going to lead to a lot of new discoveries if we start to look at life differently, and that's what we're proposing that we do.
So I guess something that I think would be really interesting we discuss here will be, when we talk about intelligent design as a scientific theory, it leads to certain conclusions that tie into, like you mentioned, the intersection of theism and faith. There are many people out there who say that science and faith cannot go together. They contradict each other. You either have blind faith or you're a scientist. What do you say in counter to that?
Well, that's what most of my work has been about, especially this last book. Yeah. There's so much to say, it's hard to know where to start. One thing to say right out of the blocks is that is in no way the historic relationship between science and theistic belief, or Christian belief in particular, Judeo-Christian belief. The early founders of modern science, figures like Kepler, Johannes Kepler, Robert Boyle, Sir Isaac Newton's tutor, Isaac Barrow, the great mathematician, John Ray. I could go on and on and on. And the late medieval theologians and philosophers, mostly Catholic theologians and philosophers, who developed methods of difference, methods of isolating variables. Many of the methods we use to systematically investigate nature were developed in an explicitly theological context at the University of Paris, University of Oxford, places like this. So the history of science is really the history of religiously motivated scholars deciding that they would like to study the natural world in a systematic way in order to give glory to God. In fact, Rodney Stark, a very fine historian of science from formerly University of Washington, later in his career from Baylor, wrote a very important book about the scientific revolution in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, just titled "For the Glory of God." For him, or for them, for the early scientists, this was the reason to study nature in a systematic way. Nature had a secret, or many secrets, to reveal. They believed there was a hidden order, a hidden design, a hidden rationality in nature that we could understand, because the same mind who created nature to have this rational, orderly structure created our minds so that our minds would be in tune with that order, and we could perceive the rationality that he had built into nature. This was one of the key ideas that gave rise to the scientific revolution. So John Lennox, our friend at Oxford, mathematician and philosopher, says, "I'm not embarrassed to be a Christian and a scientist. Christianity gave me my discipline." So things did change, however, in the late 19th century, and I tell the story of that in the book. The rise during that period, whereas a different worldview came to predominate among many leading scientists and philosophers, intellectuals. That worldview scholars call naturalism or materialism, the idea that matter and energy are the things from which everything else has come, and that they are eternal and self-existent and self-organizing. Therefore, there's no need to invoke an external creator or designing intelligence of any kind. And we live in effectively a closed system of material cause and effect. And this view came to predominate because of figures like Darwin, who told us where we came from by reference to undirected material processes, natural selection acting on random variation. Figures like Freud, who had a materialistic account of the human condition and what to do about our guilt, and Marx, who had a materialistic vision of the future. Remember, his dialectical materialism idea was the idea that purely economic forces completely govern human behavior, and the different phases that inevitably will arise in human social organization. So you had a very materialistic view of things that came to predominate. Those three figures alone addressed the most fundamental questions that Judeo-Christian religion had always answered. Where did we come from? Where are we going? And what do we do about the human condition, and in particular, the moral problem that we face as human beings? And what do we do about our sense of guilt? So there was a shift, and it's from that period in the late 19th century that this idea has arisen that there is an inherent conflict between science and religious belief. There were, at that time, works of historiography or history of science that were essentially revisionist and were writing back into the period of the scientific revolution a deep and profound conflict between science and religion that did not exist at the time. People like Draper and White, they had titles like The History of the Conflict Between Science and Religion, History of the Warfare Between Science and Religion, or Science and Christianity. So that's kind of where this idea came from. There has been conflict between some scientific ideas or theories and religious belief. Darwinism in particular, being a theory that denies any actual evidence of design in nature, has come up has generated a conflict with religious believers who believe that there is evidence of design in nature, and that passages like Romans 1 speak to that, the idea that from the things that are made, the unseen attributes of the Creator, his eternal power and divine nature, sometimes translated wisdom, can be seen in the things that are made. So that's an affirmation that directly counters the Darwinian idea that there's no evidence, no discernible evidence of design in nature. So that's a point of conflict. The question is, which viewpoint is correct, and which viewpoint is actually supported by the evidence? So we can get into that. I think that there is a conflict there, but I think the evidence actually supports the biblical perspective that says that there is evidence in support of the attributes of the Creator, in particular his wisdom or intelligence. So anyway, there has been a conflict. The big message of my book is that the major discoveries of 20th century and early 21st century science are now pointing us back to that original theistic perspective that gave rise to science and affirming the reality of a transcendent and intelligent creator who is also active in the creation, also known as a theistic God, a God of the kind described by theism, where theism is also the worldview that's implicit in the biblical portrayal of God.
So a lot of the conflicts that people would say are between faith and science, would you say that a lot of those conflicts come from theories that were, maybe designed to conflict the idea of an intelligent creator?
Well, whether they were designed to generate that conflict or not, they were. There are theories that have had implications that are contrary to theism.
Yeah. Well, like Darwin.
Marx, and Freud, I think all opposed. But what people want to say is they want to make those theories coextensive with the practice of science itself, rather than theories that may or may not be true and do not represent all of the corpus of scientific investigation and theorizing about nature, and so nor are they representative of every period of history in the history of science. So that's the conflict has arisen around a few key hot button issues and a few key specific theories, but I think so it's all a question of how you define science too. Do you mean, is science the body of all the sum total of all the theories that have ever existed? Well, if so, there are some that affirm have implications that are affirming of theistic belief, and some that have implications that are challenging to theistic belief. Another way you could define science is you could look at what scientists have discovered, that is to say, what the evidence of the natural world tells us, and there I think there is very little conflict, but rather a great deal of harmony. That the evidence is providing support for key aspects of a theistic worldview, and particularly the evidence that we have concerning biological and cosmological origins, where the universe and life came from. I think now what we're finding relevant to those questions has implications that affirm key tenets of theistic belief.
So, I mean, you mentioned Darwin, and Darwin obviously is probably the primary conversation starter in this sort of thing. I mean, you literally have the book Darwin's Doubt about Darwin, and one thing that is interesting to me, has always perplexed me, is you have, and education is a big thing in the country, especially right now, and a lot of schools, they'll teach Darwinism as a theory, the theory of evolution. But would you say they kind of teach it as fact, and do you think that there needs to be a shift where we give more credence to the theory of intelligent design, especially in education?
Well, the presentation of Darwinian evolution in high school and science college textbooks now is really out of date. It's not keeping up with the discussion that's going on in the highest levels of academia about evolutionary theory. The many leading evolutionary biologists themselves are now calling for a new theory of evolution because they recognize that the mutation selection mechanism has very limited creative power. It does a nice job of modifying pre-existing organisms, superficial traits of pre-existing organisms. Think of the Galapagos finches. And yes, indeed, the finch beaks change shape and size in relation to varying weather patterns and available food supply, but that mechanism which accounts for that minor variation does not explain well the origin of birds in the first place. Similarly, the peppered moths in industrial Midlands of England, whose coloration patterns change from dark to light and dark again, or light to dark and dark again, I can remember which, in response to varying levels of industrial pollution. Well, that's very interesting and fascinating phenomenon, but the mechanism in play there does not account for the origin of insects in the first place. There are fundamental issues or fundamental challenges that need to be met in explaining things like the distinctive body plans of insects or birds or animals, that small-scale variation that's taking advantage of latent genetic potential is that kind of phenomenon does not explain. So there was a conference at the Royal Society in 2016 convened by leading evolutionary biologists who wanted to evaluate new trends in evolutionary thinking. And the real reason for this, the reason the conference was called, was dissatisfaction with neo-Darwinism, the contemporary version of Darwin's theory, and the realization that mutation and selection do a nice job of modifying pre-existing form, but they don't do a good job, this mechanism does not do a good job of explaining the morphological innovation, the origin of fundamentally new form. And leading talk at the conference was given, opening talk at the conference given by Gerd Mueller, who enumerated what he called the explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And he listed 5 major problems with the theory, and therefore the need for a new theory. Now, there is all kinds of documentation of these problems in peer-reviewed biological journal articles and books, but very little, if any, of that percolates into our discussion of the theory in high school and college classrooms, and certainly not into major textbooks. So students are being given a sanitized version of the theory that excludes any discussion of problems with the theory, scientific problems with the theory that are well known in the scientific community. That's just an issue of scientific literacy. If we're going to teach about the theory of about the theory of evolution in its contemporary form, we need to teach, yes, the strengths, the things that it seems to have explained, but also the things that it clearly does not explain, and what leading scientists are saying about it in peer-reviewed literature. And there, the textbooks are just hopelessly behind. As to whether or not it's a good idea to teach intelligent design, we've not been pushing that. Essentially, at the college level, I don't think there's any reason you can't.
Sure.
A professor is supposed to have academic freedom. We always say teach about a theory, don't teach the theory. We're not
Right.
trying to inculcate a theory as if it were a set of doctrinal propositions. So there should be no harm in teaching about intelligent design as a competing idea to neo-Darwinism or chemical evolutionary theory, at least at the college level. The status of intelligent design or the status of teaching about intelligent design at the secondary school level in public schools is somewhat uncertain, because there was a court case in 2005 that outlawed it for a district in central Pennsylvania, but the court case has no legal standing beyond that jurisdiction, and so the legal status of teaching about the theory of intelligent design is unsettled. In principle, it seems like it'd be a good idea. Darwinism is essentially claiming, and its most important claim is that we see no evidence of intelligent design, but only the appearance of design, the illusion of design that has been produced by an unguided, undirected process, namely natural selection and random mutation, that can mimic the powers of designing intelligence without itself being guided or directed in any way. Well, if that's one side of the argument, maybe, and if the theory of evolution is actually addressing the design question, saying, well, no, we only see evidence of apparent design, it would just be a matter of, again, scientific literacy to know what the arguments are on the other side of that question. It's not apparently unconstitutional to talk about design in a science classroom, provided you say there is none. Well, that's kind of strange, because there's plenty of scientists who think there actually is evidence of intelligent design. At the same time, as a practical matter, we've been discouraging people from teaching about intelligent design at the secondary school level, because I think the concern is that it just creates a legal morass. It impedes people at the university level who are developing key scientific books, articles, research projects on the basis of the theory of intelligent design, and eventually those ideas will percolate into the schools as a result of those scientists establishing a robust ID-based research program and starting to win some of the key scientific arguments, which I think is happening. So we're not in a hurry to push the theory of intelligent design as an option into public school curriculum, but we are creating a lot of materials that people can access elsewhere, And how many students actually read their textbooks anyway?
Yeah.
They're far more likely to go online and see our videos. So that's where we're putting our efforts.
Yeah. So one of the biggest arguments for intelligent design, right, is that the chance for the Big Bang and everything to come into existence is a 1 in a billion, right? And all, as well as the fine tuning of the universe, right? Like if we shifted the Earth even like a mile away from the sun, we'd freeze to death. Or if we moved a mile closer, we'd burn to death. So one of the counter arguments to that is that, well, if the universe is infinite, and you have something infinite, eventually it's bound to happen, right? Just like if you give a monkey a typewriter, and you give him an infinite amount of time, eventually he'll write the full works of Shakespeare, right? So I guess my question would be, what would you say to that argument?
Well, the first major thing to say is that one of the great discoveries of modern cosmology, and this takes up a big chunk of my new book, A Return to the God Hypothesis, is that the universe is not infinite in time. Yeah. And there may be an infinite expansion of the universe in the forward direction of time, but in the reverse direction of time, you come back to a beginning. Mm-hmm. And so we have limited what are called probabilistic resources to overcome the extreme odds against finding, for example, all the correct values and strengths of the fundamental forces of physics that the fine-tuning term refers to. So in Signature in the Cell, I would also point out right from the onset that the main argument for intelligent design is not just a critique of the chance hypothesis. Mm-hmm. Chance is one option among several naturalistic approaches you could take to trying to explain the origin of life or the origin of the information necessary to produce life. But it happens that the chance approach to explaining the origin of life and the origin of the information necessary to produce it has fallen into disrepute within secular origin of life biology. There are no leading origin of life theorists who repair to chance as the explanation. And one of the reasons for that is the immense complexity of the cell and the overwhelming odds, if you're relying on chance in molecular interactions alone, of finding the very unique combinations of key molecular components that lead to the biomolecules that you need to make life. So I did, in Signature in the Cell, I indulged the chance hypothesis in a couple of chapters and then made some calculations. And the odds of for example, building a single protein of modest length are calculable because there's an attractability to this because we know what the constituent parts of proteins are. They're amino acids. We know how many possible combinations there are at each site. There are 20 different protein-forming amino acids. If you want to build a chain 150 amino acids long, then that turns out to be 20 times 20 times 20 times 20 to the 150th power possibilities, which ends up being 10 to the 195th possibilities. And then you say, well, okay, but there are many different possibilities that will result in a structure that will fold and could potentially perform a biological function. But research has been done on what the ratio is. How many possible combinations are there? Let's put it this way. For every combination that would fold into a stable structure that could perform a biological function, how many are there that are not? How many meaningful sequences are there compared to the gibberish sequences, if you want to use a sort of linguistic analogy? And it still comes out to be an incredibly prohibitively small exponential number. For every one, there's 10 to the 77 sequences that will not fold into a stable structure and therefore are not capable of performing a function. Well, it turns out there are only 10 to the 40th organisms in the history of the planet. So if every mutation at the point of replication, so every time an organism replicates and creates a new organism, you have a chance for a transmission of transmission of a mutation. So how many events of that sort have there been? Well, 10 to the 40th. Well, 10 to the 40th over 10 to the 77th is 1 over 10 to the 73rd, or 37th. So that means even if you take into account every mutational event that has occurred in the history of life on Earth that could be transmissible, therefore affecting evolution, you will only have sampled 1/10 trillionth of the relevant sequences in that, and that's relevant to building one protein of modest length. But you need 250 to 400 or so to build a minimally complex cell. The chance hypothesis is dead. It's overwhelmingly more probable that the mutation selection mechanism would fail than succeed, which means that it's overwhelmingly more likely that the hypothesis that that's how it happened is false than true. So these chance arguments just don't work. And this isn't simple, oh, well, it's real improbable, but we're not going to take into account how many opportunities you have to let it happen. No, we're taking that into account. In the known history of the universe, there's only been, that was a calculation I made in Darwin's Bout about how to get from one protein to another. The odds are even more prohibitive when you think about how to build a protein in the first place out of the prebiotic soup. And there you go, all the way back to the Big Bang and say, well, how many events have there been in the history of the universe? And it's still not enough to search that vast space of combinatorial possibilities for building one protein. You're only going to search a small smidgen, a tiny. It's like a needle in the haystack problem. The haystack is way too big to have a reasonable chance of finding the needle, even if you take into account how many opportunities you have to search it.
It's almost like that probability, that story of you find a watch on the beach shore, right? Where did the beach just create the watch, or did it come out of nowhere, right?
Well, that's a slightly different way of framing the argument. That was Paley's old argument.
Yes, Paley.
Robert Boyle, you made it. It's a perfectly good argument. They didn't really get into the probabilities. They were just looking at a feature of watches, the integrated complexity of the parts, and said, well, that's something we know agents do. And I think those arguments have been refined by the modern ID community. There's a positive, this chance thing is, you can do all this quantitative analysis. The bottom line is always, ain't no way. That's not how it happened. It's overwhelmingly more likely that mechanism, the mutation selection, the random search problem is so difficult that randomly searching for the thing you're looking for by mutations is overwhelmingly more likely to fail than succeed. And then if you do a second order kind of analysis on that, that also implies that if you postulate that that's how it happened, your postulation is going to be overwhelmingly more likely to be false than true. And in science, we prefer not to affirm such theories. We like theories that are more likely to be true than false. And so even the naturalists have moved on from the chance approach and said, well, maybe it was natural laws that did it, some sort of self-organizing principles embedded into nature, or maybe it was some combination of chance with natural selection. But that's problematic because natural selection only acts after the fact of a successful search. You still need the search to be successful, and that's where the odds are so prohibitively stacked against it. So I look at all these different approaches in the books, but then also offer a positive logic, a positive rationale for affirming intelligent design. And that's where the watch to watchmaker argument in the 19th century was attempting to do that. It was this idea that you could see a relationship, a means to ends relationship. The parts were configured in a way to accomplish an overall function. And Paley's argument was that when we see that type of thing, that's usually associated with intelligence. And he developed the argument analogically. I prefer to use a different logical structure, which I think avoids some of the counter arguments to Paley. But I think Paley has been unfairly maligned. There was a lot more to that. And Darwin did not refute Paley for the simple reason that his mechanism did a good job of explaining small-scale variation, but not large-scale morphological innovation. And the problems that his theory failed to solve have grown more acute over time.
So I guess something we could talk about, something that resonates with people a lot is a testimony, quote unquote. I would be curious to hear from you kind of how science and faith and how in your life this has worked out and what brought you to where you are today.
Well, I came to faith in over a protracted period of time from kind of early high school to my first year out of university, out of college. And I sort of overthought everything. I was initially induced to think about these things because I had some unwelcome thoughts that were coming into my mind as a teenager. What's it going to matter in 100 years? What is time all about? How do I know that my perceptions of the world match the way the world really is? How do I know that what I'm seeing is what you're seeing? I didn't know that these were philosophical questions. I didn't want to have these questions. They just were sort of bubbling up from someplace. And as a result of that, I started to worry that something was wrong with me, that maybe this is what it means to be insane. It was a very terrifying thought I had one day. And so eventually I found that as I began to read the Bible in some kind of maybe curiosity, maybe desperation, I'm not sure, I can't remember exactly, during my high school years, I found there were passages in the Bible that addressed some of these questions that I was having. And that made me want to investigate it more. So later in college, as I was taking philosophy classes, I learned that this nagging question I had about meaning and about this lack of. The question was, well, what's anything going to matter in 100 years? And I think it first came to me when I was reading a book about the history of baseball, which I loved. And I had been in a leg cast for several months. I broke my leg skiing, and big old cast up the top of my thigh, limited my mobility, meant my brain was spinning all the time with no outlet. But my dad gave me a book about the history of baseball, and I read it when I was convalescing. And every story they were all interesting stories, but they all ended the same way. This young, promising prospect gets scouted. He comes up quickly through the minors, has an amazing career, racks up lots of records. Maybe he wins a World Series. Maybe he hits 500 home runs in his career. Maybe he has a lifetime batting average of 300. But by his mid-30s, at the most 40 years old, he retires from baseball. Maybe he has a good life after that. He enjoys the rest of his life enjoys the celebrity of having been a great athlete. But, well, what's the point of it all? At the end of the day, it's just a bunch of numbers on a piece of paper. We can all remember those glory days. And I thought, well, but what does anything matter? I mean, even if you're a surgeon and you're saving lives, you save those lives, but when those people die and the surgeon dies and no one remembers. And after a while, I remember going through the Louvre in grad school and looking at records of Greek Olympiads. We can't even make out who those athletes were, and so what does any of this matter? And there didn't seem to be anything that had any lasting or enduring meaning or value. There wasn't any achievement that I could think to accomplish that would survive what Bertrand Russell, I later found a passage where he called it the heat death of the universe. All the highest, greatest noonday achievements of mankind will be burned up in the heat death of the universe, and no one will remember any of it. So what does it matter? And so that was a kind of a nagging, horrible thought I was having, and didn't know how to answer that question. And in any case, so I had these philosophical, existential sort of impulses that I later found, which later led me to investigate the Bible and Christianity. And I found that it was now I would say that it was materialism that was at the root of that nihilistic angst, that there's no ultimate meaning. And because nothing can mean anything to a rock or a planet or a quark or an elementary particle. Meaning is something that occurs, that things mean things to people and to persons. And if at the end of our lives there is no remaining personhood, then there is no possibility of meaning. But if there is an ultimate person who made the universe with a purpose and created us with a purpose in relation to him and to other people, then that changes everything. And so anyway, so these kind of philosophical deliberations were were influential in my coming to faith, and finding that Christianity and the Bible had a worldview that was charged with adventure and grandeur and personhood and meaning and purpose. And it was later that I discovered that there was scientific evidence for that worldview as well. And that's when I had a sort of change in my vocational direction from being a merely practicing scientist to wanting to address these deeper philosophical questions. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, that's good.
Yeah, that's good. So we talk a lot about this this intelligent design versus evolution. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, what is some of the evidence that points towards intelligent design? Like, if you give someone like one,
We're only like a 5-minute pitch. I know.
I know there's a
hard
lot.
to do condensed, right?
Well, that's what the last book was about. 3 amazing discoveries that
True.
point to the reality of a designing mind behind the universe. The first is that the universe itself had a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And that isn't so much a matter of the odds, it's a matter of the causal adequacy of any materialistic theory. Because the combination of the evidence we have from observational astronomy of an expanding universe outward from a beginning, and developments in theoretical physics, the singularity proofs that were developed by Hawking and Penrose and Ellis based on general relativity, and more recently, perhaps even more compelling proof of an absolute singularity at the beginning, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or proof of a beginning based on special relativity. Those 3 lines of evidence, I guess in one case, and developments in theoretical physics in the other 2 cases, those 3 developments point to an absolute beginning to the universe. Before which, and by the universe there we mean matter, space, time, and energy. The singularity theorem implied that if you go back far enough, you reach a spatial singularity where you approach infinite curvature corresponding to 0 spatial volume for the universe. It's a picture of the universe coming out of literally nothing. There's a way around that if you invoke something called quantum cosmology. But quantum cosmology, as I've shown in the book, has its own tacit, I think, unrecognized theistic implications. It implies that the universe came out of mind, I think. So there's really these developments in cosmology, the main being the evidence that we have that the universe had a beginning suggests that before the beginning of matter, space, time, and energy, there was no matter to do the causing, and so it becomes incoherent to hold out for a materialistic explanation for the origin of the universe when it's matter itself that came into existence, as best we can tell. And the second big discovery is that from the beginning of the universe, the fundamental parameters of physics, the strength of gravitational force or electromagnetic force, or the speed of light, or the masses of elementary particles, or the force that's pushing the universe apart called the cosmological constant, or many, many others, are finely tuned. Against all odds, these parameters fall within very narrow tolerance, outside of which life in the universe would be impossible, even basic chemistry in the universe would be impossible. So you have evidence of fine-tuning that's very well and readily explained by the idea of a fine-tuner, that the universe was a setup job. Now there's attempts to get around that with the concept of the multiverse, but it turns out that multiverse explanations actually presuppose prior unexplained and often unacknowledged fine-tuning, and I can go into that. And then the third big discovery is the discovery of the complexity of the cell, the complexity of living organisms generally, and the most striking form of complexity is the informational complexity of the DNA molecule and of other similar biomolecules like RNA and even proteins. And there I think it's just an extraordinary stop-press moment in the history of science and the history of humankind. The realization that at the foundation of life, we don't just have matter and energy, we have information in the form of a digital text interpreted by a digital code for the purpose of producing the proteins and protein machinery that we need to stay alive. So you've got information, a complex information storage, transmission, and processing system. This is what's been discovered in biology in the last, 70 years. It's just extraordinary. And it Bill Gates has said that the DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. We know that software comes from programmers. I would argue that the information in DNA is best explained by a master programmer. Whenever we see information in a digital or alphabetic form, and that's what we have in DNA, and we trace it back to its source, whether we're talking about a paragraph in a book or a headline in a newspaper or a hieroglyphic inscription in the Rosetta Stone, or information embedded in a radio signal, or information in software. In all known cases where we have information in a alphabetic, digital, or typographic form, if we trace it back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. So this is, I think, an extraordinary finding of modern science. It's not just the matter and the energy, it's the information, and information always comes from a mind. So the fine-tuning, I think, points to an intelligence, a prior transcendent intelligence. The information in the DNA, and then, say, the information necessary to build the first life, points to the activity of an intelligence well after the beginning, not a deistic creator. And the cosmological discoveries point to the need of some sort of cause which transcends matter, space, time, and energy, which falls beyond the physical world or physical universe, which, as best we can tell, came into existence a finite time ago. So those three things coupled together or synthesized suggest, I think, an intelligent designer who is active in the creation, but who also is separate and from the creation and very powerful. And so I kind of draw all those threads together to suggest that these three things taken together don't just support a designing mind of some unspecified kind, but rather a designing intelligence who has the attributes or an ensemble of attributes that Jews and Christians, for example, have long ascribed to God. This is evidence for theism as opposed to, say, deism, which might explain the evidence of design we have at the beginning, but not the activity of the designer afterwards, or as opposed to the panspermia hypothesis, which proposes an immanent intelligence within the cosmos as being responsible for the evidence we see in life, a space alien of some kind, but no being within the cosmos could explain the fine-tuning of the universe itself, or the origin of the universe itself, upon which its later evolution would presumably depend. So I think if you weigh the different metaphysical hypotheses, theism comes out very strongly indeed. I think it's the best overall explanation for what we've discovered about biological and cosmological origins, what we've discovered about the complexity and information-bearing properties of life and indeed the universe.
Wow. Well, that is really good. We can clip that out as like your 5-minute case, you know, and keeping in mind the attention span of the modern human, I think we might have to end it off here because we're at about that
Excellent.
45-minute mark.
Great,
but
great.
We're very, very grateful for you joining us for this conversation, and we'd like to offer, where can people find you?
Well, there's a wonderful website that our tech wizards here at Discovery have developed. It's called returnofthegodhypothesis.com. And all those words run together. And it's a great site for anyone interested in this topic because it's got playlists of debates that I've done. It's got animations that take you inside the cell to look at the molecular machines and the way the DNA directs the production of proteins that I've been talking about. It has other interviews I've done and other podcasters and prominent media people, and it has a list of op-eds and then ways of navigating to scientific articles, other figures in the ID research community. So that's a good place to start. returnofthegodhypothesis.com.
Perfect.
And videos. We have lots of short YouTube videos, a whole series called Science Uprising, a great little documentary called The Information Enigma. So you can find links to all that stuff if you start there. Yeah.
Perfect.
Wow, awesome. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed. Thanks again to Dr. Meyer for being on our show, and we'll catch you on the next one.
God bless.
Thank you very much, you guys. Appreciate it.